Democrats now have legislation to create a misinformation czar to push abortions. So we have House Democrats proposing, and this is always unique when Congress is trying to give the executive branch more power, but they are in this situation. They're proposing to fund a new position within the Department of Homeland, Department of Health and Human Services, which would monitor and respond to public misinformation about abortion access. While DHS was not successful in getting forward their disinformation czar, Anita Jankowicz, that has not deterred Democrats now in the House of Representatives. We have the legislation putting forward legislation to create a new czar of misinformation at HHS that will focus on abortion. And of course, as you can probably figure out right from there, will go after a lot of pro-life groups, including pro-life pregnancy centers.
Well, that's actually where it's targeted. So the House resolution is H.R. 9254. This is the title, HHS Reproductive and Sexual Health Ombuds Act of 2022, and the legislation would allow for the appointment basically of a misinformation czar about abortion access, but it goes beyond abortion access and talks about any information relating to reproductive and sexual health that is not evidence-based or medically accurate. Let me tell you what this means. This means that they are going to target, and which they've done on the state level, they're going to target the pregnancy resource centers. When we look at the legislation, we have done this, we've litigated this and won, by the way, on the state level. Now they're trying to do it on the federal level. Cece.
Yeah, and that's the exact language they use. When they say misinformation, when they want medically accurate information, they're targeting the pregnancy resource centers because their claim has always been, and apparently will continue to be, that pregnancy resource centers provide misinformation and medically inaccurate information, which is just not true.
And
so
Jordan,
it's a target against the PRCs.
Yeah, and Jordan, they also are their referral authority here. So if HHS sees that there's a violation, the Inspector General can investigate it and then refer it to the Federal Trade Commission. And that includes the ability then to have enforcement. So it would be enforced through the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. But the Department of Justice also has a consumer fraud division. So it could go there as well.
Yeah,
the referral would be from the Department of the Inspector Generals.
So it starts out at HHS. It looks like it's more of like what it looks like initially is an information source where you can figure out all the abortion laws that are going to be different in each state. That's one thing with HHS. But then, as you said, there is this referral authority which gives it teeth. So explain that more when we come back from the break. This is not just somebody gathering information. That's what they like you to believe and hope, that that's it. I mean, that again, I think is bad. We don't need this person inside the federal government. But on top of that, they're not just going to create the position without teeth. So, of course, they're going to have this referral power so that other branches of government, which have more enforcement power, can go after groups like pro-life pregnancy centers. We'll be right back on Sekulow. All right, welcome back to Sekulow. And again, if you're just joining us, let me just walk you through real briefly. The misinformation czar that the Democrats would like to create, it's like they cannot lose this issue enough. But because this one is tied directly to abortion, that would be their entire job, that there be an abortion misinformation czar inside the Health and Human Services. So this would be created by Congress. Again, the only way this happens, by the way, is in between, I think, the lame duck session of Congress post-election.
Government affairs team really looking at that to make sure it doesn't.
Yes, we should fight this hard because you're going to have a lot of Democrats going out the door who've got nothing to lose on votes because they just got defeated, especially in the House. The Senate, again, it becomes an uphill battle to get this through. But what this would do is not just provide an information source on abortion. That's part of it. But they have authority then to refer this over to the Inspector General at HHS, who can then give this information over to the Federal Trade Commission. That's got teeth. Also has teeth is the consumer fraud, like you were talking about, Department of Justice. It is new ways to go after pro-life pregnancy centers. That is their number one target right now. That is, again, outside of just the legal battles they're fighting in the states, their grassroots battle is to try and have liberal blue states shut these pro-life pregnancy centers down. And we've seen them try and do this time and time again. But here they are doing it at the federal level with they want to put someone in charge of that effort who will be the leader to try and shut down the pro-life pregnancy centers. We're going to go right to the phone. Robert's calling in from Maryland on line 1. Hey, Robert.
How you doing, Jordan and Jay? Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I wanted to ask the both of you if you could give me more information on what this Misinformation Czar office entails, and also will they have the capacity to use some of the spy apparatus of the National Security Agency as a weapon to further harass crisis pregnancy centers?
So, Robert, here's what it says. I'm going to read it for you. It says under Section 5, it says to provide the public with evidence-based and medically accurate information related to medication, abortions conducted outside formal medical settings. So it's not just on the abortion centers themselves, but any of the abortion pills, to collect information regarding and to address reproductive and sexual misinformation being disseminated to the public. That's number 6. Circle that one, because this idea of reproductive and sexual health information being disseminated to the public, of course, targets the crisis pregnancy centers. Then take it a step further, and then it says, and this is what we got to really make sure why we defeat this bill, to coordinate with the FTC, that's the Federal Trade Commission. They can coordinate, collect information, and address consumer protection and data privacy concerns on the provision of any services relating to reproductive and sexual health. That's going to allow the FTC to get in on these pregnancy resource centers and go after them for what? It's going to be going after them, CC, for, quote, misinformation. By the way, this comes on the heel of Friday with the FBI saying that misinformation, disinformation is now an election crime, and that cheat sheet they had, which we've got a team of lawyers working on right now. Go ahead.
Right. So misinformation, we've seen it where they even claim that, ultrasound machines even give misinformation. So what they can categorize as misinformation is really unending. But if you have any information that goes against the abortion narrative, that will absolutely be deemed misinformation. Medically inaccurate, if you have information showing how abortions affect women, how they have more miscarriages after, that is medically accurate, proven information, but that is always deemed by the abortion distortion people that that's medically inaccurate. So that section for sure, when they talk about misinformation, is directly targeted at pregnancy resource centers, absolutely, without doubt. And the fact that they can inspect, investigate, and audit, that would be targeting these resource centers.
We're taking more of your calls.
Yeah, let's go right to the phones. This is a good one. Let's go to John in California on line 3. Hey, John.
Hey, thank you very much for taking my call. I love what you guys do. So we all know a fetus is a developing human being. I think they put themselves in a box with this medically accurate stuff because now they have to prove it's medically accurate that a fetus isn't really a human being. They have to, viability has been changing for years. It used to be they used to do surgery on babies without anesthesia because they didn't think they could feel pain. The science is showing earlier and earlier and earlier where this so-called viability line is.
Yeah, but here's what you've got. When you've got an administration that's hostile to the life position, that is protecting the very person you're talking about, the unborn child, what's going to happen? I mean, just under this scenario is they're going to say the information given out by the Pregnancy Resource Center is inaccurate, it's misleading, and it's fraudulent. And that was the position of the state of California, and that's been the position of the state of New York. And now they want to do is authorize, is basically weaponize now Health and Human Services, which would have jurisdiction over all 50 states, to start these investigations through their misinformation czar. You understand what they're doing to the First Amendment? They're turning it upside down. I mean, they're so concerned about shutting down conservative viewpoints, pro-life viewpoints, that they will go to any extent. And now that extent includes, in this case, which is just bizarre, to say the least, a misinformation czar to go after. It's targeting the pregnancy resource centers.
Absolutely. And they're not hiding it. I mean, they use the same language that we have seen and litigated, like you said, in New York, in California. We've litigated and we've won in these states when they target pregnancy resource centers using the same information, saying it's misinformation, it's medically inaccurate, it's confusing, it's misleading. And of course, they will say anything that is against abortion falls into that category.
Jordan, this is also a political move. I mean, this is coming. You said the only time they could get this to the lame duck session when they still have the House, because in all likelihood, come January, they're not going to have it.
Right. I mean, this is
a political move.
to try and, again, bring up the abortion issue.
You're right. I think the politics are showing that. But here's what this bill says. I want to go back to it. Public outreach. The secretary shall take all appropriate actions to advise and engage with the public regarding the existing authorities and duties of the ombudsman and the ombudsman's office. And the ombudsman's office is where this misinformation czar is going to be based. And that misinformation czar then targets the Crisis Pregnancy Center, the Pregnancy Resource Center, who then refers it by the Inspector General, who does an investigation, which tries to put them out of business just by investigating, and then gets over to the Federal Trade Commission. So now you've got to fight the Federal Trade Commission, which we will stand with every crisis pregnancy center that's subject to this if this bill were to get through. But you know the way to win this is don't let this bill become law.
Absolutely. We fought it before with the misinformation czar that they tried to put in. This is, again, or disinformation czar. This is the same thing. It's a misinformation czar specifically targeted for abortion. And, what's amazing is they're trying to also, they're definitely targeting pregnancy resource centers, but they're also going to tell you where you can get an abortion, where you can get funding for an abortion, how you can get medication abortions. So they're going to just be pushing. It's a all-out push to support and promote abortion wherever they can, however they can. If you're in a state that doesn't allow abortions or have restriction on abortion, they're going to give information on how to go elsewhere. Again, get funding, ask off. They're going to provide all that information. Meanwhile, targeting and trying to shut down the pregnancy resource centers by saying that they provide misinformation, disinformation, and medically inaccurate information.
We represent, Jordan, crisis pregnancy centers and pregnancy resource centers literally coast to coast, and we have for 40 years. So we got to defeat this legislation. That's why we have an Office of Government Affairs. That's also why we have ACLJ action to engage these kind of issues at this level.
Yeah, absolutely. We want your support at aclj.org. You can also join ACLJ Action to become a member of ACLJ Action. It's a $25 donation. That's at acljaction.org. And again, this is how we are engaging these issues at a multi-level fight, whether it's the Washington, D.C. federal side, whether it's happening in your states, whether it's a vote, whether it's a legislative battle at the state level, federal level, or, of course, at the ACLJ, all of the legal battles. I think more and more we're seeing from some of these state efforts is that the courts are going to have a role to play, but it's not going to be necessarily the federal courts. Now it's state courts that are going to be having this new role to play in the post-Dobbs world.
We do have a couple of calls that are still coming in on what we talked about earlier on with this misinformation czar now on the abortion issue. Let's go ahead and take Judy out of Oregon on line one. Go ahead, Judy.
Hi. I was just curious because I completely trust you guys. If you say it, it's true. I don't question it. On my email, I got a notification in capital letters that said infanticide just legalized in California. Right. Is that true?
Yes, because they included on their definition of abortion, they included that it can be perinatal, not just prenatal. Perinatal is post-delivery. And they give you 100 reasons why they're doing it, but the end reason is they don't want any of these investigated. So it's horrific. It's what the former governor of Virginia tried to do years ago. It was like 3 or 4 years ago, which ended up costing him the Democrats for the Virginia seat, that and what they did to parents. And the fact is that we're on top of it. I mean, we filed comments on it, but in California, the first line of defense is going to be the pregnancy resource centers. But let me tell you, if this legislation, which we're going to fight aggressively against, were to get through, Jordan, again, this plays right into the political season, too. That's how they would get those closed down, through the Federal Trade Commission. I mean, I cannot imagine the words coming out of my mouth are that the FTC will be investigating crisis pregnancy centers and pregnancy resource centers, but that's exactly what this legislation authorizes.
Yeah, it did it in late September of 2022. It was AB 2223, which legalized some forms of infanticide. As we say on our website, we have this full resources up for you at aclj.org/abortion. You can look up your state. It's got a map of the country, so you can click on every state and know what's going on, whether there's legislative battles, whether there's initiatives that are being voted on, or just the honest truth about where things stand right now. And that's where they use that perinatal period, which is up to 28 days after birth, which is why we use the terminology infanticide. They intentionally used that language. It included it there in these states. We knew that was the case. We said there's going to be states that enact very radical pro-abortion legislation, and that we were going to see that in the bluest of blue states, and we are, which is why it's a long-term campaign in those states to talk to the people, the voters, the elected officials, as well. But we're not giving up. We've been unleashed in a post-ops world to do that work. Support the work of the ACLJ at aclj.org. That's aclj.org. It's again, we don't have this at a federal level anymore in our country, and that's a great thing. But we've got to fight state by state now to save lives. That's aclj.org. We'll be right back. You know, we're talking so much about Dobbs in the post-Dobbs world that it's almost tough to imagine the Supreme Court's been back.
Yes.
For a month. And, you know, we did a preview about some of the more high-profile cases, but there is one that was split up today into two different oral arguments on affirmative action that is making a lot of news because it could be the first major shift in about a little more than a decade on affirmative action at the court.
It's on race-based admissions, and our friend and colleague Patrick Strawbridge.
Very different angle than people may think.
Different angle because it's primarily affecting Asian students, actually.
Absolutely.
Harry's going to talk about this in a moment. But what's interesting in this is I never forget the words of Chief Justice John Roberts when he said the way to end race discrimination in admissions is to stop discriminating on race in admissions. But that's not, it's kind of the opposite of actually what's happening. Harry, what is at stake here and what was going on at these universities in particular?
Well, a lot was going on, but first and foremost, these two schools seek to protect their ranking and the selectivity of their admission process while simultaneously improving the diversity of admissions on the basis of race. And so if you focus, for instance, on merit, this naturally favors Asian American students. Why? Because the average Asian American student in the United States studies 13 hours per week in elementary and secondary school versus 5.5 hours for non-Asian students. So that would mean that Harvard and the University of North Carolina would be overwhelmed with a large number of Asian American students. I don't have a problem with it.
Right.
That is what merit is all about. But universities have a problem with that because when they talk about diversity, they mean diversity of ethnicities. And if Asian students are overrepresented by then that will mean that non-Asian students will be underrepresented. So both the University of North Carolina and Harvard today seek to defend a policy which, in my judgment, violates the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And I think both Harvard and North Carolina, this is based on my assessment, reading the briefs, they will both lose, and in my judgment, they ought to lose. In other words, we ought to encourage each and every American to take advantage of a meritorious system, study hard, work hard, and we should move away from the approach offered, which is so-called holistic admissions. And holistic admissions mean that we hide the discrimination from the eyes of the court.
So let's talk about what we're talking about here. You get students that are applying that are qualified. But because this is like reverse discrimination, it is reverse discrimination.
It is reverse discrimination.
But because their qualifications and they're within a particular ethnic class or racial-based group, and there's too many of those students that would qualify, they're out.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is when you realize that these kind of policies have run their course. But when you're starting with a policy to help, diversify and make sure that students who are underrepresented or represented gets to a point where it's now being used to exclude a minority in the United States. Yeah. And again, I think that we've all gotten to the point where, especially these schools that we're talking about here, where
UNC and Harvard,
these are pretty woke places. Let's put it mildly, to say the least. So they're not like, again, the Supreme Court even saying you can't have this policy. I think what it just does is just levels the playing field for another predominantly minority group who's applying for these positions.
Who's being discriminated. You understand what's happening here, folks, is Asian American students are being discriminated against because of this policy, like in record numbers.
Yeah, we're not talking about from overseas. We're talking about Asian Americans.
American students. These are American students that are associated with a particular class or race. This one is Asian American. These are Asian students that are Americans.
Yeah, I think the two hardest ways to get in right now, it's probably I think number one is probably if you're Asian. Number two is if you're a white male. I mean, those are two things in these schools, and they're doing it on paper. They're not just saying like, "Oh, this is part of our consideration." This is like an active policy. So it's again interesting here because you have one private institution, one state institution. Some states have barred the use of affirmative action from their state universities, but that's only a minority of states. And again, they both receive federal funds, so they both the federal government and the Supreme Court has oversight here. Most people are predicting that this is going to be the end of affirmative action.
I was going to ask you, Harry, what do you think is what's the likely outcome? What is the outcome that the plaintiffs are looking for, petitioners are looking for here?
Well, basically the invalidation of the current admissions process and simply focus on merit. But both institutions recognizing that a focus on merit would actually, in practice, favor Asian American students, they are arguing against merit while simultaneously trying to maintain their selectivity ranking in U.S. News by focusing on merit. So they only want a limited number of Asian American students, and the argument that they have settled on is if we get a sufficiently diverse class of students ethnically, this leads to, or this produces truth. Well, the reality is if they were truly interested in truth, they should increase the number of conservative students that they're admitting to their classes, because it is the clash between liberals and conservatives that produces truth, not the clash between ethnicities.
So we argued in our brief, here's our argument, I'm going to read it to you because I think it sets up what this case is about. Tying benefits or burdens, which would be admissions, to racial labels is race discrimination. Racial categories are arbitrary and ultimately incoherent. And then we also say the history of government racial classification of individuals is not one that should be imitated. So you understand what this is. It's reverse race discrimination.